For those of us who grew up in rental store aisles with our noses tucked in the pages of monthly gaming magazines, some games just had a strange allure to them. Sitting on that shelf, mysterious box art looking out and begging to be rented. Maybe you took it home, played it a little, and it goes back to that shelf, incomplete, destined to be a half-formed memory that clings in the back of your mind forever. A door left ajar for what could have been, a happy memory of something vague and unfinished ready to ferment into something rosier as the years pass. So what happens when you go back to that game, almost 20 years later, and try to fill the gaps in your memory, to close out the book once and for all? What if that thing stays unfinished, but in a different way? What if it's always been incomplete, not due to your failure, but due to the failure of those who put it on the shelf in the first place? Strap in. This one's going to be a little rough. There are few names in gaming as well known as Kojima Hideo. The man is a veritable legend, a titan of industry inextricably linked with both beloved franchises and the careers of a veritable dream team of talent that has worked alongside him for decades. His fans love him, his critics loathe him, and his presence on projects can sell copies just as well as it can set expectations for the weird and wacky. The closest thing video gaming has to the Hollywood auteur, Kojima's name alone has opened doors for new IP and partnerships in an industry otherwise known for its fear of risk. Perhaps the greatest example of this so-called Kojima effect is with the Zone of the Enders series. Born from an idea Shinkawa Yoji had as a child, and originally beginning production as a pitch for a PS1 and PC game called Kyuyo Taisen, the 9-Day War, the project was reworked multiple times, shifting into a general mecha focus as it adopted the codename Atlantis and eventually became Zone of the Enders. After Shinkawa approached Kojima with the early mech concept work, Kojima handpicked his longtime collaborator Okamura Noriaki to direct the project due to the work they did together on both Metal Gear and Tokimeki Memorial. Early in the prototyping phase, Murata Shuyo was brought in to write the game's story, where he helped shape its identity from a more lighthearted and comedic shonen mecha series into its darker and more mature final form. According to an interview conducted for the release of the series' 2012 HD remaster, Kojima was inspired to develop the game for the Dreamcast after noticing a spiral motif on Patrick Duffy's pants in the 1970s television series Man from Atlantis. Despite this, the final product would launch on the PS2 thanks to the system's improved rendering and processing capabilities. Zone of the Enders sold most considerably in the West, where it was bundled with a demo of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. In a way, the series itself is a footnote to the larger marketing opportunity the franchise represented in an industry where gaming celebrities were few and far between, and none shined quite as brightly as Kojima. Bolstered by the impressive sales numbers for the new franchise, Konami quickly greenlit a sequel and positioned Zone of the Enders for multimedia expansion. Partnering with legendary anime studio Sunrise, of Gundam and Cowboy Bebop fame, Konami would quickly work on expanding the Zone of the Enders IP with a 60-minute-long prequel OVA, a full-length 26-episode broadcast anime series set around the events of the first game, and a side-story strategy RPG for the Game Boy Advance developed by Sunrise subsidiary Winkysoft, also known as Sunrise Interactive, a studio known for their work on the Super Robot Wars series. Okamura would step back from his role as director and hand the reins to series writer Murata Shuyo for the full-fledged 2003 sequel Anubis, Zone of the Enders 2: The Second Runner. After the release of the second game, the series would go dormant for 9 years. In 2012, an HD collection port of the series was released on PS3 and Xbox 360. A Vita port was announced, but never surfaced. Around this time, Kojima himself announced that work had begun on Zone of the Enders 3, but unfortunately this also never came to be. In May of 2013, the project was officially cancelled due to lagging sales of the HD collection. By the time this video is published, the series has been effectively dead for 12 years, with the only notable release being an HD port of the second game developed by Cygames, titled Zone of the Enders 2 Mars, which was released in 2018 for the PS4 and PC with full VR support. Even though the series hasn't seen a new mainline entry in over 20 years, it maintains an enduring, if small, fan base to this day. Recapping the story of Zone of the Enders is a Herculean task, but not for the reasons one might expect from a franchise with Kojima's name on it. Missing are the twists and heel turns, the labyrinthine conspiracies and crisscrossing allegiances of characters caught between multiple perspectives. By all accounts, the story of Zone of the Enders is relatively straightforward mecha fare. But in a way, that's the problem. Before we get started here, let it be known that I tried. I tried so hard. Feel free to skip ahead to approximately 47 minutes and 24 seconds. If you want to avoid the spoiler-heavy recap and discussion. I'll just be waiting here in the meantime. Give you a few seconds to just, mosey on over. You guys play Lorelei and the Laser Eyes yet? Crazy game, right? You should probably just go play that. The story of Zone of the Enders comprises an animated OVA, a full-length 26-episode anime series, and 3 games. The 2 mainline PS2 games are actually relatively short, meaning that most of the series' narrative is left to the supplemental material produced as part of the collaboration with Sunrise. The quality on these projects varies drastically. The bigger problem being that all of it is undeniably canon and included in Kojima's own timeline for the series. The first Zone of the Enders can be summarized pretty quickly. A young boy, neglected by his father, comes face to face with massive death and human suffering during a terrorist attack on the Jupiter colony of Antillia. Amidst the chaos, he stumbles into the cockpit of an experimental orbital frame, that's this series' version of mechs, called Jehuti, and bonds with its onboard AI, a being known as Ada. Recruited by the United Nations Space Force to deliver Jehuti to their awaiting forces in orbit using a space elevator, Leo rescues his childhood friend Selvis, and the pair fight their way across the colony, protecting the everyday citizens from the terrorists as they make their way to their scheduled rendezvous. Along the way, Leo struggles with accepting the necessity of violence and conflict for the sake of protecting his loved ones and is forced to reconcile his ideals with the reality of war. Zone of the Enders 1's core narrative is nothing to write home about. A thin justification to hurdle the player headfirst into objectives that would serve to string together progression for the game's otherwise barren, tech demo-level gameplay. But that's enough, and accompanied by an excellent score and some great visual design, it serves its purpose. Viola, the main antagonist, is a great foil to Leo. It's just a shame most of her development didn't occur in the first game. Viola was set up in the OVA, Idolo. At a young age, she was subjected to unfiltered cosmic rays after an Earthling terrorist attack against her home colony on Mars. Harboring great hatred for Earth, she was eventually recruited into the Martian militia known as Bahram by Radam Levins, an ace pilot. Over time, she fell in love with Radam, though the love went unrequited. As the pair was brought in as test pilots for the then-new orbital frame program, Viola was forced to watch as Radam's sanity slowly deteriorated, culminating with his explosive death in space after an attack on the Bahram Noctis base went awry and his lover Dolores, a key researcher on the program, was killed in the crossfire. Forced to fight against both the UNSF forces attacking the base and his own allies at Bahram who sought to keep the orbital frame program secret, Radam went down in a blaze of glory, destroying a massive space station in an event later dubbed the Deimos Incident. We meet back up with Viola as she leads the B-Team attack on the Antillia colony, 5 years later. Viola was doggedly radicalized, forced to live in the shadow of her oppressors and the very people who stole everything from her. Like a wounded animal, she thrashes against the UNSF and the status quo, and naturally comes to despise Leo and his idealism. To Viola, life is a never-ending battle, and someone like Leo who believes in pacifism above all is fundamentally incompatible with her view of the world. In her most captivating moment, Viola shoots Selvis in the chest while locking eyes with Leo and tells him, "You need this done to you." Zone of the Enders reaches its conclusion with Viola's death. After a fight with Leo leaves her mech disabled and pulled into Jupiter's gravity, she reaffirms her worldview, telling Leo that if he tries to save her, she will just fight him again and again and again until one of them dies. Leo is changed heavily by his exposure to Viola, not into a cruel or even necessarily eager soldier, but into someone who understands that violence exists in the world and is not something that can be merely ignored. As he escapes from Bahram's clutches and delivers Chahiti to the UNSF, he now understands what truly is at stake and how he can protect those he loves. This is where things get a little scattershot. Zone of the Enders was, from its outset, a marketing exercise. Most people know the series in relation to Kojima, his name plastered on the box next to the big sticker advertising a demo of MGS2 packed in with the first game. This was the 2000s, games were weird and experimental, and companies were hungry for all the money and attention they could get from sponsors and partnerships. Thus entered Sunrise. Production began with Idolo, a prequel produced as a short 60-minute OVA released in March of 2001. Nothing exemplary, but also serviceable and maybe even tasteful as a supplement to the games, detailing the earliest test flights in the Orbital Frame program, and expanding on background events in the series and fleshing out Viola, the main antagonist of the first game's story. But this was not the end of the Sunrise partnership. A full-length television anime, 26 whole episodes airing on Animax and ATX, would follow just a month later. Itself followed by an interstitial title for the Game Boy Advance half a year or so after that. I normally like to keep these recaps dry and direct to best encompass the story being told, so you can have a better grasp of the bigger picture. But in the case of the anime series Dolores I, this is extremely difficult. I am not going to mince words here. This series is pure, unmitigated, weapons-grade 2000s-era digipaint cringe. Set in 2172, 5 years after the ending of Idolo, and just before the start of the first game, the first 13 episodes of Dolores I are a meandering mess detailing the escapades of the estranged and dysfunctional Lynx family. Alcoholic trucker and patriarch James, tomboyish mechanic Noel, and spineless salaryman Leon. After encountering a sentient orbital frame named Dolores, the family is forced into hiding when they're blamed for a series of terrorist attacks and are forced to fight off both Bahram and UNSF forces pursuing the mech. All the while investigating Dolores' mysterious origins and link to the family matriarch, Rachel, the head researcher from the orbital frame tests depicted in the Idolo OVA. The family wanders from place to place, meeting all sorts of goofy characters and getting into all kinds of wacky hijinks. Among these characters are the heir to a Martian mafia family and his gold digger girlfriend who secretly is in love with James for some reason, an old man who has built an entire spaceship using scrap metal who feuds with the local government due to his lack of building permits, and a literal smuggler baron who runs an illicit space station in an asteroid field. The family comes to learn that their differences aren't so big as they slowly come to realize that James's wife, Rachel, is not in fact dead and is the subject of a massive cover-up, reuniting their family and aligning them to the major conspiracy. Rachel was, as I mentioned, a character in Idolo, the head researcher working on the orbital frame tests, and technically a key character in the lore. While they search for clues to Rachel's whereabouts, they're hunted by the inept UNSF police force, headed by an Edgar Rice Burroughs fan who dubs James John Carter for his Martian ties, because that's clever, I guess, as well as a group of dangerous Bahram clones enacting the shady plans of their terrorist superiors. If you're sitting here thinking, Toaster, this doesn't seem too bad for an early 2000s tie-in anime, I've seen worse, I promise you I've spared you the worst of it. It isn't offensive, really, at least not compared to some things from the time, and it's not the most poorly assembled tie-in media I've ever seen, but the problem lies in its characters. Most of them are one-note cardboard cutouts, simple assemblies of well-established shorthand and tropes that quickly become grating. James is a failing father, so all of his character beats boil down to him reading a self-help guide that gives him tips on how to be a better dad to his adult children, often overly simplistic and extrapolated into goofy gags and plans that shouldn't work out but do. Noelle is sort of a non-factor. She's hardly there. And Leon is more often than not brash and rude until suddenly he isn't and comes around. It's Gundam by way of Scooby-Doo, anchored by Dolores herself. The setup of an orbital frame with an autonomous sentient AI is something the series will mine again multiple times in the future to greater effect, but Dolores stands out here as a major misfire. The mystery of her name and the connection to Radam's lover Dolores is palpable to anyone who has seen Idolo. And I'm going to measure a guess that most people who go out of their way to watch this garbage have seen Idolo. But the show seems utterly uninterested in paying that off in the first half at all, as none of the characters have any context for Dolores, or Bahram, or any of the ongoing metaplot in the series chronology up to that point. Her connection to Rachel Lynx boils down to the fact that she, for some reason, believes James is her destined uncle and sings a lullaby often that Rachel sang to the kids when they were young. She spends most of her time prancing around, and I mean that literally, like an inept moe fish out of water who doesn't understand the world until the plot needs her to fight off enemies or awaken to her destructive power in a deus ex machina. These deus ex machina moments are really the only times the plot becomes intriguing, where it's set up that Dolores is really just the surface personality of a deeper subroutine known to Bahram as Isis. So, the first 12 episodes of Dolores are ultimately filler. Filler that details how the Lynx family goes from bumbling idiots scattered across the colonies to bumbling idiot fugitives with a mech on Mars, ready to finally investigate the cover-up of their matriarch's alleged death with the help of a bunch of randos with a bone to pick against the various factions who have it out for the average people of the colonies. It is not a compelling start to a series, really in any way, and getting through those first 13 episodes was truly one of the hardest things I've ever done for a video. The first game takes place after the first 12 episodes of the series, and episode 13 ostensibly picks up from the ending of the first game. Unfortunately, the second half of the show isn't too much better at picking up from plot threads that are established in that game. James meets a Bahram pilot named Rebecca, who's deeply intertwined with Ridley Hardiman, a man also known as Nomon, the mysterious leader of Bahram and the pilot of an orbital frame known as Anubis. Key to this plot is the head of Neridum Universal Technology, an arms dealer named Napth Pleminger, who acts as a key financier and political operative for Bahram. Interestingly, the B-plot here is vastly more important than the A-plot featuring the Lynx family, who mostly continue to bumble their way around, still pursued by Bahram and the UNSF police force from before. Eventually, the family reunites with Rachel Lynx on Mars, who explains every detail of the enemy plan to them in one of the series' more unwieldy exposition dumps. Rachel wanted James to hide Dolores, knowing that Bahram was planning on using Dolores and the other orbital frames to destroy a strategically important space elevator. A true patriot, Rachel left James and her children originally to help liberate Mars, her homeland. But ever since then, she's been essentially held hostage by Bahram after the events of the Deimos incident depicted in Idolo, largely due to Nomon's influence. Rachel reveals that Dolores, that is to say the orbital frame Isis, was created from the wreckage of Idolo found after the Deimos incident, and that Dolores was based on Radam's lover as thanks for giving her life to save Rachel. To make matters worse, in an absolutely stunning display of disrespect for the narrative of Idolo, it turns out that Radam Levins actually survived the events of the Deimos incident, and ever since has been living as a cyborg with false memories as a strategically planted Bahram sleeper agent. This, of course, is Napth Pleminger. It's around this time that the already bloated show begins to feel even more crowded as everything comes to a head. It's hard to reconcile the A-plot with the B-plot here, as James and the rest of the Lynx family insert themselves into the conflict more and more as plot threads begin to coalesce and Dolores herself is forced to engage more directly with Bahram, something the show has managed to avoid doing for most of its runtime up to this point. New orbital frames begin dropping into the plot like it's an episode of Gundam trying to sell new toys, and the final arc accelerates quickly and sloppily as the tone shifts from wacky family mecha comedy drama towards a more grounded geopolitical and psychological focus. The Prime Minister of Mars initiates a coup and officially declares the liberation of Mars, the start of a major war that would span the rest of the series. Radam goes on the offensive against the UNSF and occupied forces, making his survival known to the public as he rampages against the occupiers. Much time is spent on his grudge against Mecha Dolores, who he perceives as having stolen his lover's name. While watching footage of the coup, James declares Radam the true enemy. While I think the rest of Dolores I fails to understand its place in the Zone of the Enders canon, this moment might be the biggest misstep in the entire series. Obviously, Radam serves as the big bad of the anime, the original instigator of the events of the series in the first orbital frame pilot, so naturally the show would pit the Lynx family against him, and more importantly pit Dolores against him. The spirit of a lover forced to fight back against the man who lost her, and with her, his sanity. The issue here, though, is that Radam isn't really the true enemy. I mean, he is a bad guy, a psychopathic radical who lost his mind to what was effectively space MacGuffin poisoning in the prequel OVA, but that isn't really what this series is about. It isn't even what Idolo was about. One key aspect of nearly every single character in Zone of the Enders is that they are casualties of war, either through literal bodily harm and oppression like Viola, or through secondary losses, like Leo, the Lynx family, and most importantly, Radam himself. The causes of war and the things that push people to conflict are not some inherent flaw in their personalities, nor are they the result of any one single person's actions. War is a byproduct of the systems of greed and oppression that isolate people on geopolitical and class bounds. The very name of the series, Zone of the Enders, refers to the disparity of the outer colonies and the perceived class difference between those who live on Earth in the capital of the UNSF and those who are pushed out to the expanse, forced to make do in colonies and deal with economic hardship. James turning to Radam as the sole inheritor of blame, no matter how villainous he is an embarrassing reversal of the series' narrative up to this point. It is actively hard to forgive, and is especially difficult as the very next episode heavily examines the effects of racism and prejudice against Martians from the UNSF operatives attempting to prevent the Bahram coup. Radam passionately argues that Earth will never understand Martian suffering until an equal amount of Earthling blood is spilled, which he believes will allow for a future without roots in evil to bloom. But it's hard to feel the pathos in his statement amidst the goofy hijinks happening on screen. Again, major plot points are delivered with the gravitas of a slapstick children's cartoon, as Radam stands triumphant, his invisible orbital frame Hathor shielding him from bullet fire, essentially a Martian Superman, as James flimsily argues that he's just making excuses to step on others. Just as Radam is about to destroy Dolores, he sees a strange vision as a green light envelops his cockpit, and he flies off into space to attack the reconstructed Deimos station. There, he meets with Nomen and Anubis, who let him pass without conflict. Back at base and preparing for Deimos' fall, James and Rachel work to repair Dolores. James delves into a weird VR cyberspace metaverse and wanders into a fragment of Idolo's memory left over from the original Deimos incident, which manifests as the church where Radam saw a delusion of his and Dolores' wedding at the end of Idolo. Inside the church, James finally meets the spirit of Dolores Hayes, Radam's lover. James manages to convince Dolores that she isn't actually the ghost of Dolores Hayes and is actually Dolores Lynx, a member of his family, and somehow the power of familial love is enough to restore her AI and bring her back online. I got nothing, y'all. I'm really trying here. Everything comes together as you'd expect. One final battle in space as the UNSF, Bahram, and the Lynx family all fight outside Deimos Station. Leon and Noel get into some hijinks as they attempt to take over the station to purge storage capsules and drop weight. Radam, fully hallucinating his ghostly lover again, mostly rehashes the ending of Idolo, with Radam hallucinating his wedding with Dolores, interrupted by James, in the same way he hallucinated Viola interrupting his wedding during Idolo. Once again, Viola is relegated to the sidelines, even in presentation. James and Radam have a fistfight in the hallucinatory church as the mechs fight in reality. Radam even experiences a vision of Viola arriving, only to shoot her dead on the spot. It's revealed that this was actually Rebecca, who had vied for his attention and love the entire season as Radam's adopted daughter. But it's hard not to feel the pain of Viola's arc being relegated to the sidelines just to serve as a narrative rhyme for the purpose of paying off some random side character's arc in this supplemental anime. What a waste. Ghost Dolores continues to incite violence between Radam and James, even making herself visible to James in Dolores' cockpit. At one point in the fight, not one, not two, but 3 ghostly visions of Dolores appear in the hallucinatory church. The adult ghost Dolores, the evil ghost Dolores, and a child Dolores all argue as James tries to convince Radam to turn back to good. Lucid enough to determine that there's no taking back what he's done, Radam then attacks James once more and is defeated, stopping the attack on the colony. With little time before the orbital elevator falls, Radam's mech reawakens and embraces Dolores, helping her pull the orbital elevator into the moon's gravity with the assistance of the Raptor drones he was commanding, saving the day as Dolores sings the Lynx family lullaby. Here, we're given a flashback to all the wacky family moments seen over the course of the series, and Dolores finally, mercifully dies, saving those she loves. That is, until the epilogue, where it's revealed that the family has reunited, and Dolores has been revived as the AI of the family's space hauler. This show just never could really stop getting in its own way, could it? It's hard to overstate just how bad this series is, how much of a misstep its wacky hijinks are, and how far off the tone of the rest of the series it is. Those who followed the production of this video will know that I rewrote this story summary section twice, laboring over how to do the franchise justice while grappling with the disastrous ramifications of this awful anime and its effect on not only this video, but my motivation towards covering the series as a whole. I didn't want to skip it because it is, by volume, the largest part of the narrative of the series. Despite its relative obscurity, it's actually most of the canonical text of Zone of the Enders. And yet, it's also so different from the rest of it, so backwards and so confused. Dolores I is utterly supplemental, and it feels like a massive waste of time. I struggled with this, I really did, and that's what makes the next part maybe the most interesting. Developed for the Game Boy Advance by Winkysoft, also known as Sunrise Interactive, Zone of the Enders 2173 Testament, The Fist of Mars, takes the episodic anime structure of Dolores I and blends it with the grid-based tactical gameplay you'd find in something like Advanced Wars or Fire Emblem. It also features a real-time targeting mechanic when fights are initiated, allowing the player to avoid hits with clever maneuvering. Clearly driven by a team willing to take chances on a project that otherwise could have been completely phoned in, Zone of the Enders, The Fist of Mars is a genuinely interesting piece of interstitial media, and one that pays much more respect to the rest of the franchise than the anime that preceded it. Set a year after the events of Dolores I, The Fist of Mars centers on a 17-year-old boy named Cage Midwell who works on a luxury space cruiser with his best friend Ares. As the Bonaparte 3 nears Deimos Station, Cage follows a strange girl named Miona into a restricted cargo bay, and suddenly the ship is attacked by a mysterious orbital frame, and the pair are forced to climb into their own for safety as the ship explodes. Stranded in space and forced to fight off the attacker, the pair crash-land on Mars and form an alliance with the onboard AI named Farsty. Taken in by Martian authorities, they're blamed for the attack on the Bonaparte and find company with the Martian rebel group Born in Space, a ragtag band of freedom fighters independent from Bahram who seek to help the common folk of Mars. The members of BIS form the core cast of Fist of Mars, a group of lovable humanitarians chock full of 90s mecha tropes and charm. Where the Lynx family felt one-dimensional and flanderized from the outset, the cast of Fist of Mars feel rich and textured in that 90s, 2000s era digipaint anime sort of way. Though not without its stumbles, the story feels fully realized within the constraints of the Game Boy Advance. Even if it's not particularly unique or innovative thematically, Fist of Mars does work, giving each character a clearly signposted set of goals and themes that develop over the course of the game. Broken into 26 chapters dubbed episodes as if it were an anime, the Fist of Mars manages, somehow, to pack more character development across its 26 missions than Dolores manages to do across its entire runtime. Fist of Mars is most interested in exploring the various factional motivations underpinning the Zone of the Enders franchise and its central conflict. As Cage helps the born-in-space rebels protect the Martian civilians caught up in their revolution, he gets first-hand exposure to the many different competing parties with a vested interest in the planet. With the occupying force of the UNSF struggling to maintain peace as racist tensions flare and the police oppress the populace, the UNSF's interplanetary Black Ops cell Asimos is sent in to shake things up. Bofrom lingers in the background, as arms dealers and megacorporations like Neridum Universal Technology and the Ryan Corporation attempt to influence local politics. So too does Cage meet other resistance groups like the Mars Angels, an independent vigilante group of 3 women who take odd jobs and protect the various Martian colonies. Fist of Mars attempts to frame these factions not as simply black or white, but as people pushed to ideological extremes by the circumstances of war. Cage reunites with Ares and becomes closer with Miona, and he helps BIS deter false flag crises initiated by the UNSF itself. Dexon, the leader of BIS, becomes a de facto father figure for him and the others, stressing the importance of saving civilians in fighting for a better future. Among the BIS cadets are Rosma, the womanizing sniper with a heart of gold, Semmel, the hot-headed orphan demolitions expert, Yukito, an avid otaku and heir to a locally important corporation, Mebius, a widow, and the de facto older sister of the group who has an unspoken love for Dexon, and Phil Bright, West Riverside, Warehouse Rock, the 26th. Yes, you heard that correctly. According to the lore, he's named this way because long names are considered lucky on Mars. As I said, the game isn't without its stumbles. He's an effeminate and flamboyant young man with a crush on Miona. Joining the crew later are soft-spoken mercenary Warren, as well as wealthy technologist Robin O'Connell, who helps bankroll the resistance operations from the shadows with the assistance of her right-hand man, Tweed. Despite its heavy influences from the era, Zone of the Enders Fist of Mars is interestingly forward-thinking. At one point, Rosma, the womanizer, explicitly states that trans women are women, and at a later point, when Yukito and Warren are teased in a typical BL layup, Yukito plays along, and the rest of the crew seems to have a positive view towards homosexuality. It's important to remember that this game was released in 2001, when these topics were decidedly more taboo, so these moments actually do a lot to characterize the members of BIS as well-meaning and open-minded resistance fighters truly coming together to appreciate life and find peace for people of all backgrounds. Most of the early game is focused on Cage and Miona's onboarding into BIS after Ares rescues them from prison. He miraculously survived the attack on the Bonaparte, surprising both of them. The group dynamics are set up quickly, and the team is thrust into the day-to-day of the Resistance as they attempt to unravel the conspiracy surrounding the Bonaparte 3 and the involvement of the Asimos task force on Mars. Led by self-hating Martian Nadia Candido, under command from the sadistic and hateful Boleslav Velazgo, the UNSF has been more directly involved in local Martian affairs ever since the coup attempt depicted in Dolores I. Seeking a method of obtaining true orbital frames for Earth, the UNSF works with disgraced scientist Dazil Zephyrs, now a high-ranking UNSF inspection chief stationed on Mars. Zephyrs kidnapped Martians and experimented on them with the goal of creating more efficient frame-runner candidates, a plot device that feels like an echo of the new types from the Gundam franchise. Heavy focus is put on the exploitation of war orphans in Semmel's arc, which revolves around her recruitment into BIS from a local orphanage and the ensuing attacks done on the orphanage with a goal of covering loose ends from Zephyrs' experiments. The plot truly kicks off when it's revealed that Ares was the pilot of the mysterious orbital frame that attacked the Bonaparte. Real name Vale Shatner, and brother of Miona, whose real name is actually Farsty, Vale held a grudge against Azil Zephyrs after the scientist killed their parents and performed experiments on him and his sister, resulting in the creation of the Farsty AI and the experimental Anubis frame for the UNSF. Escaping from captivity, Vale was recruited by Bahram and spent years planning Zephyrs' downfall, which led to his stationing on the Bonaparte III and his friendship with Cage under the pseudonym Ares. Cage and Ares' friendship and rivalry serve as the center point for Fists of Mars' campaign. Cage constantly compares himself to Ares, idolizing his determination and strength, even as Ares turns on the BIS crew in his quest for revenge. Cage was literally born in space on an emigration spacecraft, a boy without a homeland who was orphaned at 13. Cage drifts between causes on a more humanist basis, drawn to people and their tangible plight, rather than more abstract nationalist justifications for conflict. Ares, on the other hand, is so driven by his pain and grief that he loses connection to the people around him, and like most other villains in the series, begins pursuing a nihilistic, mutually assured destruction, merely propped up by his proclaimed loyalty to Mars. In this way, Cage's place as an other among others helps humanize him and connect him with the oppressed, whereas Ares' place as a traumatized war orphan pushed him to the fringes and radicalized him, much like Viola from Zone of the Enders 1 and Idolo. Ares' betrayal leads to further complications as Phil defects with him, frustrated by BIS's adoration of Cage and his unrequited love for Miona. Phil's upbringing was happy and idyllic until an experimental drug trial gone wrong caused his biological father to turn abusive against him and his younger siblings. Acting in self-defense, Phil murdered his father to protect his siblings and eventually found his way to BIS, finding community and purpose with the Resistance. Feeling sidelined by Cage, Phil's guilt was exploited by Ares, who recruited him for a secret purpose. Rigging Phil's orbital frame to self-destruct, he planned on using the boy as bait to take out Cage and the rest of BIS. Ultimately, this plan is foiled by Dexon, who sacrifices himself to save Phil. Dexon's death profoundly affects the rest of the crew, as Robin is forced to step into a bigger leadership role and the Resistance mounts its offensive against Ares for the protection of Mars. Phil lives by Dexon's example and sacrifices himself to save Cage, ensuring the creation of his idealized future. The rest of the group gets over their differences and mounts a final offensive against the Bahram contingent. It's your standard anime fare, but it works. The group of lovable Resistance fighters united by tragedy, fighting for a better future, coming together to oppose an edgelord doomer who wants to burn the world down. The game concludes with an epilogue on Daimo's station, showing where the heroes ended up. Warren and Mebius adopt an orphan and raise it as their own. Yukito assumes de facto leadership of the Resistance under the tutelage of Robin and Tweed, while Rasma and Semmel lead the orphans and turn their protective gaze over the people left on the fringes by war and strife. The credits roll as Miona and Cage depart the station to seek their place together in the universe. It's a happy, hopeful ending, and one that wrapped up the themes of the series relatively cleanly and on a pretty definitive note. That is, until a post-credits scene explains that the entire plot of the game was orchestrated by Nomon behind the scenes in order to strategically take out his opponents within Bahram Command, leaving no one to oppose his rise within the organization, setting the stage for the crown jewel of the franchise, Anubis, Zone of the Enders 2, the second runner. A year after the end of Fist of Mars, ex-Bahram frame runner Dingo Egret lives quietly working on Callisto as a civilian Metatron miner. Tracing a high-density Metatron signal to the top of a glacier, Dingo finds an abandoned orbital frame, Jehati, and is forced to pilot the mech as Bahram attacks the mining operation. Fighting off a Bahram operative, Dingo enters the Bahram warship in an attempt to lead the fight away from his co-workers on Callisto. On the ship, Dingo is subdued by Nomon, who pilots Anubis, with the assistance of a Nath drone being autonomously controlled by an AI ghost of Viola. Imprisoned and taken back to Bahram Command, Nomon asks Dingo to rejoin Bahram and take up arms against the UNSF. In the years since Dolores, Nomon has changed. His hair has gone white, and he's turned even more violent and extreme as the Bahram organization has devolved under his tyrannical command. Dingo calls him out for the demagogue that he is, and this impresses Nomon, who rewards him with 2 bullets to the back. Acting quickly, Ken Marineris, the frame runner who fought Dingo on Callisto, reveals herself as a UNSF double agent and takes Dingo to Jeheti, where a member of the medical crew rigs Jeheti's life support system to revive Dingo and keep him alive as long as he stays in the cockpit. Stuck as a living weapon for the UNSF under Ken's command, Dingo escapes and heads for Mars to stop Bahram. Mars by this point has been completely occupied by Bahram's forces, heavily bolstered by the use of autonomous frames and AI-driven war machines. BIS was completely destroyed as well, reiterating the unfortunate metaplot centering around the fact that thematically resonant moments simply cannot persist in this series. As Dingo fights off the Bahram drones, he catches the eye of a powerful prototype LEV called the Vic Viper 2, a Gradius reference for those paying attention, piloted by none other than Leo Stenbuck. Recruited into the UNSF, he at first assumes that Jeheti had been stolen by Bahram before coming to a truce with Dingo. Leo's overall attitude has changed significantly since the first game, and he's matured into a much more capable and determined pilot than he was 2 years prior. Despite the Vic Viper's status as an LEV, it's by far the most dangerous enemy combatant in the game thanks to Leo's prodigious piloting prowess. As the game continues, Leo opens up to Dingo and serves as a mirror for Dingo's own situation. Both of them were essentially recruited into the UNSF service against their will, but over time come to understand their place in the greater war. Leo isn't Dingo's only companion in this story, though. Ken is also a constant presence, following him deeply into enemy territory and aiding him over the radio. Bearing a grudge against Nomon for the death of her father, Ken reveals that she isn't actually even working for the UNSF. She's truly just been pissed at Nomon the whole time and is using Dingo as an opportunity to achieve her goals. After her mech is disabled due to a virus planted by the Viola AI, Dingo rescues Ken and the 2 seek an engineer named Lloyd, an acquaintance of Dingo's from his time at Bahram who can upgrade Jeheti. If there's any moment in the second runner that really stands out, it's the Lloyd fight. Like most of the bosses in Zone of the Enders 2, Lloyd is a relatively simple gimmick boss where you have to navigate through pitch darkness and avoid his bullet hell obstacles. But the ominous ambiance is heavily supported by the absolutely stunning guest character and mech art done by none other than Shin Megami Tensei's Kaneko Kazuma. Lloyd is mostly just testing Dingo's capabilities, a paper-thin justification for a boss fight to string the plot together, and when you beat him, he transfers the upgrade data to Dingo and is swiftly murdered by Nomon, exiting the plot as quickly as he entered. Ken and Dingo are separated, and Dingo leaves to help the UNSF forces penetrate Bahram's defenses in Vasilia. Following the Lloyd fight are the 2 biggest set pieces of the game. The first is an assault on Bahram's air carriers, the goal to take out each one using Jeheti's vector cannon transformation, which requires the player to take out the carrier's defenses and then hunker down to charge the cannon. It's a cool set piece, if a bit repetitive. It's immediately followed by a massive ground-level battle between UNSF and Bahram forces. This was a big deal for the PS2, with tons of models visible on screen as the combatants are forced to skirmish. Dingo's goal is to keep as many of the UNSF operatives alive as you slowly whittle down the drone army, simulating a hectic offensive front while the radio constantly blares with help requests and the screams of dying comrades. It's simple, and it's effective. And it leans into the best aspect of these games, the feeling of being an ace mech pilot slicing through enemy squadrons faster than they can track you, running circles around everyone else on the battlefield. Making his way to Phobos, Jeheti's abilities are further awakened, and Dingo gains a short-range teleport. Leo and Dingo fight off Anubis outside the Urimbek catapult, but the pair realizes that they're actually fighting a mass production decoy being piloted by the Viola AI with Ken stuck inside. Leaving Leo to help Ken, Dingo pursues Nomon through hyperspace using the catapult and makes it to Phobos. Contacted by Elena, the UNSF operative who worked with Leo during the first game, Dingo states that he'll work with the UNSF if it means the uncompromised liberation of Mars. Stuck between a rock and a hard place while facing down the annihilation of the solar system, the UNSF finally agrees to Dingo's terms and grants Mars freedom. This is the part that doesn't really land for me. The idea that after all of these massive space events, it takes the literal obliteration of the solar system for the UNSF to give up control of Mars. Despite gaining what everyone wanted, including Bahram's original goal, Nomon is still unswayed, ultimately just interested in destroying everything for completely nebulous, nihilistic reasons. I've been critical in the past of villains like this on my Let's Play channel, but it's so hard to take this stuff seriously, especially when it positions itself as an ideological struggle. Nomon's ideology and motivation are so absurd, so fundamentally unreasonable, that it would not hold water even for a tyrannical leader. Even greedy people seek something. Even fascists and tyrants have wants and needs. In history, the pettiest of reasons often motivate the cruelest of tragedies. But Nomon is, truly, ideologically and philosophically void. He simply wishes to destroy the universe because I guess we need a final boss? Philosophy is fundamentally about the complexities and nuances that motivate us and allow us to understand the world, but Nomon is not nuanced in the slightest. He is literally just a cartoonishly evil villain for the sake of being evil. I think this does a great disservice to the ground-level conflict this series ostensibly cared about, the complicated natures of war and its participants. In the end, Bahram is a death cult that wants to destroy the solar system. The UNSF are a peacekeeping force that eventually acquiesces, and we're left with random people of various indeterminate factional alliances who are magically capable of saving the world and liberating Mars simply because they're built different. It's hard not to feel like the series is constantly at odds with itself and can't decide how it wants to frame each of its factions. Killing Nomon and throwing Anubis into the Owlmon core does enough to disrupt its destructive capabilities, localizing the nuke to Phobos, giving Leo and Dingo time to escape. Unfortunately, Dingo takes the brunt of the blast, and Jeheti is left in ruins. Ken saves Dingo using the mass production Anubis, and back at base, Leo finally reunites with Ada, and Dingo is given the life-saving surgery he needs.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
One of the worst realities of making something is realizing that the thing you're working on isn't coming together. You can pour your all into something, and no matter how coherent your thoughts are, no matter how cogent your thesis, the final product can end up feeling like a half measure, unable to fully represent what you wished to portray. The amount of effort and creativity that goes into making something requires a massive amount of commitment and dedication, and it's hard to burn through your reserves and then realize you're only halfway to where you need to be, with only fumes left in the tank. That's what making this video has been like for me. I've been busy with projects, I run a full-time Let's Play channel, I just bought a house, I work a full-time job, and I produce a pretty labor-intensive tabletop show with its own writing commitments and audience to satisfy. It often feels like I don't have enough energy to make it to my destination on any given day without adding more to my plate, but videos need to be made, and things need to be written. It's hard to step away from a project. Playing, researching, and writing about Zone of the Enders has been a difficult endurance challenge. Every piece of this franchise harbors echoes of my own struggle. A dogged determination to get to a finish line, an attempt to weave something out of nothing overshadowed by a constant transitional state that never can fully reach a valuable conclusion. A door better left ajar, one that makes me feel something nostalgic as I walk past, but never through. Zone of the Enders is an interesting idea. Mechatropes explored and mined by fans of the genre, different creative teams given free range to do what they want and play with the ideas they're most interested in. But it never fully comes together, leaving each disparate part feeling like it builds to nothing, just a jigsaw puzzle missing pieces that never fully forms a clear picture. And yet, like those producers attempting to make content, I'm tasked with making a video. And that means I must find something to say about Zone of the Enders to tie this all together. I wrote this script wondering if such a workmanlike approach was what these games were ultimately advocating for. That conflict is messy, that we all have obligations and the best we can do is work through them until we can put them behind us. I'm not sure. I don't know if the exhausting, often obnoxious Lynx family's happy ending really meant anything in the context of the greater universal conflict. But I can say that with every episode I watched, the less enamored I became with this franchise, the mystery of its appeal slowly eroding until I was left empty-handed. Was Dolores in the partnership with Sunrise Entertainment worth it for the creation of the somewhat underbaked but undeniably overlooked Fist of Mars? It's hard to say. In the end, the more supplemental entries in the franchise feel like an afterthought, a marketing gimmick that wastes an opportunity to truly solidify the franchise's ideas into something more tangible. So much effort to cross a finish line with no gas left in the tank. Zone of the Enders feels like an artifact out of time, a game that exists on the shelves of rental stores and in my memory, incomplete and hazy. Revisiting it now, I can't help but wonder what could have been, had the team at Konami been able to fully realize their potential and bring this series to a more fruitful conclusion. Indeed, upon re-examination, Zone of the Enders feels unfinished, an assembly of ideas pieced together and unified by an aesthetic and general thematic goal, but one that can't seem to push itself forward. At the end of the second runner, with Martian independence looming, it's hard to not feel like there was still a future to look forward to, that the best was yet to come now that the narrative had finally moved past its establishing acts, and yet there was no more. This experience was tinged with melancholy. Playing these games was not discovering something new or widening my horizons. Instead, it was discovering where the boundaries were, finding where the invisible walls stood in a limitless field I'd been playing in for years in my head. I didn't remember how truly sudden the endings of these games were, or how little ground they actually covered in their stories. The dynamic, fast-paced mecha action of my wide-eyed childhood was replaced with repetitive, relatively rote combat encounters that didn't have much strategy involved. Gimmick bosses took the place of the captivating enemy combatants of my younger years. The facade fell, and with it I saw the games for what they were. Tech demos, marketing projects, offbeat assemblies meant to fill in gaps in a production on a release calendar, buoyed by the big names attached to the projects. Supplemental materials and spin-off projects destined to be footnotes on wiki articles and developer resumes, forgotten by the discourse. Zone of the Enders is so little, made from so very much. The hardest part of scripting this video, and the thing that took the most time during production, was ultimately finding out what I had to say about this series, and if I had anything to say at all. Maybe I don't, and yet here I am, with a pile of content produced for an audience, still stuck having to give you something to justify this. Maybe that's all I needed to do to begin with, to just take you on the journey, to give you a look into something and let you do with it what you will. In a way, I think that's part of the series' ultimate draw. It's always been about what could have been, what could be. But a game about war can't exist without conflict, and the moment those conflicts end, well, that's a gap for our minds to fill in. Mars may be liberated, and the Enders may be free from Terran oppression, but the orbital frames still exist, and the draw of precious resources like Metatron still commands the attention of the powers that be. We must find meaning in the lack of closure, the lack of an end, because nothing ever ends. Not in the ways we want it to. These are themes that Kojima would revisit on his own with Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain later in his career, a similarly unfinished game, but one whose unfinished ending is very much part of the greater message. To leave something open, to imply a statement about to be uttered, is as much saying something as it is not. Zone of the Enders stops here, between an ending and the beginning of something new. Defined as much by the negative space as it is by what is actually there. Zone of the Enders is a series that gestured towards a future it would never be part of, and it leaves us in the liminal space between artistic ambition and reality with the polite urge to say something, even when there's nothing new to say. So long, and thanks for all the fish. This one was a little painful for me. Multimedia is always a challenge to work with, and examining different mediums and how they interact with storytelling is interesting, even if that storytelling is a little bit half-baked. Plus, playing games even tangentially related to Kojima always feels a little bit like coming home. If you want to help support the creation of these kinds of videos, you can subscribe to me on Patreon over at patreon.com/toastedringtail. You can get early access to stream VODs, Let's Plays, and other content over there as well. And you'll get sneak peeks of essay scripts and test cuts and other random stuff I feel like working on and posting when I get to it. If you want to hang out and watch along while we play games I cover, you can follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/toastedringtail, where I stream just about every day. I'm also obviously on YouTube, both here and at Toasted Ringtail, where you can find all my VODs and previous Let's Plays. I think the biggest hurdle with making videos like this really is going to be finding things to say. I struggle with social anxiety and hate talking when I feel like there's nothing to be communicated. I feel compelled to reach for things to say, and when I come up empty-handed, I feel like I'm left with an uncertainty that doesn't really feel comfortable, an insatiable need to fill space. Everyone knows that's what questions are basically made for. Here's some questions from my community Discord. Vulcan asks, you can use magic of one element. What element is it? I'm assuming you're speaking in the sense of like the 4 traditional elements of water, fire, earth, and air. Depending on the limitations, earth would probably be my pick, though air would also be very practically useful. Ruben asks, who's your favorite protagonist? This is a meaty one. It depends on who qualifies. Lots of different answers depending on what qualifies. If we're talking TV, I love the quartet of protagonists from AMC's classic Halt and Catch Fire, as well as Elizabeth and Philip Jennings from FX's The Americans. If we're talking manga, probably Poon Poon above anyone else. Games, though, I'm not sure I could definitively answer off the top of my head, but the first characters that come to mind are Raz from Psychonauts, or maybe Zidane from Final Fantasy IX. I'm not really sure, though. I really like Delita Hyrule from Final Fantasy Tactics as well. Krim asks, which Zone of the Enders has your favorite combat or story? I think the second runner is probably the best of the games, if I just had to pick one to play. But I don't know. I think they're all kind of the same level of quality overall. Aegis Lord says, do you have any guilty pleasure media you're willing to share? I don't really have too much guilty pleasure media. I generally tend to think that stuff that isn't good just isn't good. There's no like movies that are so bad that I like them or that I think they come around to being good or anything like that. But I think the closest thing I have that qualifies is I have a playlist of every single archived G4 TV episode that have been uploaded to YouTube. And sometimes I just shuffle that and put it on when I need background noise or I just want to zone out before bed. That's probably the closest I get to this sort of like guilty pleasure media. And the reason for that is because historical games coverage is something I find very interesting. Regardless of how the tone of games coverage and the quality of games coverage has changed over the years, historical coverage is very useful for doing research on contemporary releases and kind of what was going on at the time that those games came out. So it's great research for these videos, and it sort of fills the blank space in my brain.